Every day, thousands of Harlem residents placed their bets, nickels, dimes, quarters, on three-digit numbers that could change their lives overnight. It was illegal. It was everywhere, and the man who controlled it didn't just run a lottery, he ran Harlem itself. This is the story of the policy racket, Harlem's underground lottery that pulled in millions of dollars and became the economic backbone of an entire community. And this is the story of how Bumpy Johnson turned an illegal numbers game into an empire that gave him more power than politicians, cops, and mobsters combined. If you're here for the real history, the economics, the strategy, the untold stories of how our communities survived when the system tried to crush us, hit that subscribe button now. We're breaking down one of the most fascinating and misunderstood operations in Black history. Before state lotteries, before Powerball and Mega Millions, before gambling became a multi-billion-dollar government revenue stream, there was the policy racket. In Harlem during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the numbers game wasn't just gambling. It was infrastructure. It was employment. It was hope. It was a parallel economy that functioned when the white-controlled financial system locked Black people out completely. For Harlem families during this era, playing the numbers was as routine as buying groceries. You'd give your policy runner a few coins, pick your three-digit number, maybe based on a dream, a license plate, or a significant date, and wait for the daily drawing. If your number hit, you could win 600 to 1 odds. A dime bet could turn into $60 overnight, enough to pay rent, buy winter coats for your kids, start a small business. But the policy racket was also dangerous, corrupt, and controlled by people who understood that money meant power, and power meant survival. And no one understood that better than Bumpy Johnson. By the 1940s, Bumpy had become the undisputed king of Harlem's numbers game. He controlled the runners, the collectors, the banks, and the payouts. He decided who operated and who got shut down. He mediated disputes, enforced rules, and made sure the money kept flowing. But how did the policy racket actually work? How did Bumpy gain control? And what did this illegal lottery mean for the people of Harlem? This is more than a story about gambling. It's a story about survival, economics, and what happens when a community builds its own systems because the official ones were designed to exclude them. The policy game didn't start in Harlem. It came from elsewhere, evolved, and found its perfect home in Black neighborhoods across America. The origins trace back to the late 1800s and early 1900s when similar lottery systems existed in immigrant communities, Italian, Irish, Jewish neighborhoods where people played small-stakes games based on numbers drawn from stock market figures, horse races, or other unpredictable sources. But in Harlem, the policy game became something different. It became community infrastructure. By the 1920s, Harlem was exploding with Black migrants from the South and Caribbean immigrants seeking better lives. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of Black folks north, searching for jobs, dignity, and freedom from Jim Crow terror. What they found was northern racism, different but still suffocating. Banks wouldn't give Black people loans. Employers hired us last and fired us first. Landlords charged higher rent for worse housing. The legal economy was designed to keep us poor, powerless, and dependent. So our communities built alternative systems. The policy racket was one of them. Here's what made Harlem's numbers game special. It was Black-owned, Black-operated, and Black-controlled, at least initially. Operators like Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the brilliant Caribbean immigrant who built Harlem's most successful policy bank, saw the numbers game as more than profit. It was economic self-determination. It was keeping money circulating in our neighborhoods instead of being extracted by white-owned businesses. Policy operators hired Black runners to collect bets, Black accountants to manage books, Black enforcers to provide security. The money stayed in Harlem, supporting families, funding businesses, and creating jobs that didn't exist in the white-controlled economy. And for everyday folks, the policy game was hope. During the Great Depression, when unemployment in Harlem reached 50% and families were starving, a winning number could mean survival. It wasn't just gambling. It was a lifeline in a system designed to let us drown. So how did the policy racket actually function? Let's break down the mechanics of Harlem's underground lottery. The basics: every day, players would choose a three-digit number, anything from 0,000 to 999. Bets were small, usually between 5 cents and $1, amounts that even the poorest families could afford. Policy runners, neighborhood figures who worked specific blocks, would collect bets throughout the day. They'd write down each bet in a small notebook, tear off a receipt for the customer, and move on to the next house, barbershop, or street corner. By late afternoon, runners would deliver their collected bets and money to a policy bank, a central location where operators managed the operation. The drawing. Here's where it got interesting. The winning number needed to come from a source that couldn't be manipulated, something public, unpredictable, and verifiable. Different policy operations used different methods. Some used the last 3 digits of the day's total handle at specific racetracks. Others used stock market closing figures. Some used the U.S. Treasury balance published daily in newspapers. A few used the clearinghouse totals from major banks. The key was transparency. Players needed to trust that the game wasn't rigged, that if their number hit, they'd actually get paid. The payout. If your number won, the typical payout was 600 to 1. A dime bet would return $60. A dollar bet would return $600. That might not sound like much today, but in 1930s Harlem, $60 could cover a month's rent. It could feed a family for weeks. It could change everything. But here's the twist that made the policy game so profitable for operators. The actual odds of winning were 1,000 to 1, but the payout was only 600 to 1. That 400-point gap was pure profit. Operators kept roughly 40% of all money bet, an enormous margin. And because thousands of people played daily, those margins added up fast. Successful policy banks could pull in $10,000 to $50,000 per day in 1930s dollars, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. That kind of money meant power. And it attracted attention from rival operators, corrupt police, white mobsters, and anyone else who wanted a piece. If this breakdown of the numbers game is revealing a side of Harlem history you've never heard before, drop a like on this video. It helps more people discover these untold economic stories. Bumpy Johnson didn't invent the policy game, but he perfected it. By the late 1930s, after surviving the war with Dutch Schultz and proving himself as Madame Saint-Charles Clair's most trusted enforcer, Bumpy was positioned to take control of Harlem's numbers racket. His approach was strategic, not reckless. Bumpy understood that controlling the policy game wasn't just about violence. It was about organization, trust, and community relationships. Here's how Bumpy consolidated power. 1. He built a professional operation. Unlike chaotic street hustlers, Bumpy ran the numbers game like a legitimate business. He kept detailed records. He paid out winnings reliably and quickly, building trust with players. He hired competent managers and accountants. He created systems that could scale. Players knew that if they hit a number with Bumpy's operation, they'd get paid. That reputation was everything, too. He protected his runners. Policy runners were the backbone of the operation, the street-level workers who collected bets and built relationships with customers. Bumpy made sure his runners were protected from police harassment, rival gangs, and street crime. If a runner got arrested, Bumpy paid their bail and legal fees. If they got robbed, Bumpy hunted down the perpetrators. If they had family emergencies, Bumpy made sure they were taken care of. That loyalty created loyalty in return. Bumpy's runners were the most dedicated in Harlem because they knew their boss had their backs. 3. He negotiated with power. Bumpy understood that the policy game existed in a complex ecosystem of corrupt cops, Italian mobsters, and local politicians, all wanting their cut. Rather than fighting every battle, Bumpy negotiated. He paid off cops strategically, keeping them satisfied but not dependent. He formed alliances with Italian crime families, agreeing to revenue-sharing arrangements that preserved black control over day-to-day operations. He cultivated relationships with Harlem politicians, offering financial support in exchange for protection. It was a delicate balance, maintaining autonomy while acknowledging the realities of power. 4. He became a community figure. This was Bumpy's secret weapon. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a neighbor. He mediated disputes between residents. He made sure elderly folks had what they needed. He funded local events and supported black-owned businesses. When someone in the neighborhood was in trouble, they came to Bumpy before they went to the police, because Bumpy actually helped and the cops just harassed. That community support translated into protection. People looked out for Bumpy because Bumpy looked out for them. But here's the question that defined Bumpy's reign. Could he maintain control when everyone, from rival black operators to white mobsters to federal law enforcement, wanted what he had? Controlling Harlem's policy racket made Bumpy Johnson rich and powerful. It also made him a target. Rival operators. Not every black policy operator was willing to fall in line under Bumpy's system. Some ran independent operations, competing for customers and territory. These conflicts occasionally turned violent, runners getting jumped, policy banks getting robbed, threatening messages sent. Bumpy handled these situations with a mix of negotiation and intimidation. He'd offer partnerships first, merge operations, share profits, maintain peace. If that didn't work, he'd apply pressure, cutting off their supply lines, turning their runners, or making it clear that continued resistance would be costly. Most operators eventually cooperated, a few didn't, and disappeared from the scene. The Italian mob. The biggest external threat came from Italian crime families, particularly the Genovese family, who saw Harlem's numbers game as a revenue stream they wanted to control. After Dutch Schultz's death in 1935, the Italian mob took a more strategic approach. Instead of outright war, they offered partnerships, providing political protection and police payoffs in exchange for a percentage of profits. Bumpy negotiated these arrangements carefully. He agreed to share revenue, but insisted on maintaining black operational control. The Italians could have their cut, but Harlem's policy banks would remain black-owned and black-managed. It was an uneasy alliance, mutually beneficial but always tense. The Italians had more political power and resources. Bumpy had community support and street-level control. Neither side could completely dominate the other, so they coexisted. Police corruption. The NYPD was perhaps the most constant threat. Cops regularly raided policy banks, arrested runners, and seized money, not to shut down the operation, but to extract bribes. It was legalized extortion. Cops would raid a policy bank, take the day's receipts, arrest a few people, then negotiate a payoff to drop charges and return the money, minus a fee. Bumpy had to maintain relationships with corrupt cops, paying them enough to stay cooperative, but not so much that they became dependent or greedy. It was a constant calculation, balancing costs against operational security. By the 1940s and 50s, federal law enforcement began targeting organized crime more aggressively. The FBI, IRS, and federal prosecutors saw the policy racket as a way to build cases against major criminals. Bumpy was arrested multiple times on various charges: tax evasion, conspiracy, drug trafficking. These cases were often built through informants, wiretaps, and financial investigations. The pressure was constant. Every transaction was a potential legal liability. Every associate was a potential informant. Every day brought the risk of indictment. And in 1952, that risk became reality. Bumpy was convicted on drug charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, temporarily ending his direct control over the numbers game. But even from prison, Bumpy's influence remained. His organization continued operating, managed by trusted lieutenants who maintained his systems and waited for his return. So what did the policy racket actually mean for Harlem's residents? The impact was complex, both beneficial and harmful. Positive impacts: economic opportunity. The numbers game created thousands of jobs in Harlem. Policy runners, collectors, accountants, enforcers, all employed in a black-controlled enterprise. For people locked out of mainstream employment, these jobs provided income and dignity. Community investment. Successful policy operators like Bumpy Johnson reinvested profits into Harlem. They funded community events, supported black-owned businesses, and provided informal social services that the city government refused to offer. Financial lifeline. For struggling families, a winning number could mean survival. It paid rent, bought food, covered medical bills, and created breathing room in lives defined by economic desperation. Black economic power. The policy racket demonstrated that black people could build and manage sophisticated financial operations. It was proof of competence and capability in a society that constantly denied both. Negative impacts: addiction and loss. For some people, playing the numbers became compulsive. Families would bet money they couldn't afford to lose, chasing wins that rarely came. The 600-to-1 payout sounded good, but the 1,000-to-1 odds meant most players lost more than they won. Violence. The money involved inevitably attracted violence. Turf wars, robberies, and enforcement actions created danger in neighborhoods. Innocent people sometimes got caught in the crossfire. Police harassment, the illegal status of the policy game, gave corrupt cops an excuse to terrorize Harlem. Raids, arrests, and shakedowns were constant, targeting black neighborhoods while ignoring white-run gambling operations. Moral ambiguity. The policy racket existed in an ethical gray zone. It provided economic opportunity, but also exploited desperation. It funded community services, but also normalized criminality. It represented black power, but also perpetuated cycles of illegality. For Harlem residents, the policy game wasn't simply good or bad, it was survival in a system that offered few alternatives. Bumpy Johnson's control of the numbers racket made him wealthy and powerful. But it also made him a community figure, someone who understood that his success depended on maintaining trust, providing value, and protecting the neighborhood that sustained him. And that legacy, the complexity, the contradictions, the survival strategies would outlast Bumpy himself and reshape how we understand black economic history. Real question: if you were living in 1940s Harlem with limited job options and a family to feed, would you have played the numbers, worked as a policy runner, or found another way to survive? There's no judgment here, just honest conversation about survival under oppression. Drop your thoughts in the comments. The policy racket in its classic form eventually faded, not because law enforcement shut it down, but because governments co-opted it. By the 1960s and 70s, states across America started launching official lotteries. They used the exact same model that black operators had created decades earlier: small stakes betting, daily drawings, published results, large payouts. The difference? State lotteries were legal, heavily promoted, and generated billions in government revenue. Revenue that often didn't flow back into the black communities that had pioneered the concept. It was the ultimate irony. The same system that had been criminalized when black people ran it became legitimate when white governments controlled it. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, just 5 years after his release from prison. He'd reclaimed his position atop Harlem's underworld, but he was operating in a changing world. The civil rights movement was reshaping black political consciousness. The heroin epidemic was devastating communities, and the numbers game was slowly being absorbed into state-run systems. But Bumpy's legacy remained. He'd proven that black people could build sophisticated, profitable enterprises even when the law criminalized them for doing so. He demonstrated that economic power could translate into community influence and protection. And he'd shown that survival under oppression required intelligence, strategy, and a willingness to operate outside systems designed to exclude us. The policy racket was never just about gambling. It was about agency, autonomy, and the refusal to accept economic erasure. The numbers game in Harlem was one of the most fascinating economic and social phenomena in American history. It was illegal, but it employed thousands. It was exploitative, but it provided hope. It was dangerous, but it created community. It was criminal, but it demonstrated black economic sophistication that white America refused to acknowledge. And Bumpy Johnson's control of that system made him more than a gangster. It made him a power broker, a community figure, and a symbol of black autonomy in an era of systematic oppression. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What does it mean when survival requires breaking laws designed to oppress you? How do we judge people who built economic systems because legitimate ones were closed to them? When is criminality actually resistance? There are no easy answers. Bumpy Johnson was neither hero nor villain. He was a complex human being, navigating impossible circumstances with intelligence, ruthlessness, and a deep understanding of power. The policy racket is gone now, absorbed into state lotteries that generate billions, while communities like Harlem still struggle with poverty and disinvestment. But the memory remains, the lessons remain, and the reminder remains: our ancestors built empires with nickels and dimes, genius and grit, when the system tried to leave them with nothing. That's not just history, that's legacy. If this deep dive into Harlem's numbers game opened your eyes to economics they don't teach in school, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're documenting the untold financial histories, survival strategies, and power moves that shaped Black America. Next up, we're exploring Bumpy Johnson's final years, his relationship with Malcolm X, and the legacy he left when he died in 1968. Like this video, comment with what surprised you most about the policy racket, and share this with anyone who needs to understand this history. This is our economic legacy, our survival story, and it deserves to be told right. See you in the next one.